Nakamura had never seen American women in person. She had seen propaganda images, of course, cartoons depicting American women as lazy, corrupt, morally decadent creatures who smoked cigarettes and neglected their children. The women before her bore no resemblance to those caricatures. They wore crisp uniforms with insignia Nakamura did not recognize. Their hair was styled, their faces showed concern rather than contempt. One stepped forward, a woman perhaps in her 30s with auburn hair pulled back in a regulation bun. She spoke in careful accented Japanese. "Welcome. My name is Lieutenant Commander Margaret Lawson. We are members of the Navy Nurse Corps and the American Red Cross. We have asked you here today because we have been informed of the conditions in the repatriation centers. We want to help." The interpreter, a Japanese-American woman in civilian dress, translated the words. Nakamura listened, but did not react. Help could mean many things. Interrogation was help, from a certain perspective. Documentation was help. She waited. Lieutenant Commander Lawson continued. "We understand that many of you lack basic necessities. Clothing, especially. We have gathered donations from American servicewomen stationed in Japan and from relief organizations back home. We would like to offer you these items freely, no obligations." Behind her, other American women began opening large wooden crates. They pulled out folded garments, dresses, skirts, blouses, coats, shoes. The items were clearly used, but in good condition. Nakamura saw a dark blue wool coat emerge from one crate, its buttons intact, its lining visible. An American woman shook it out gently, smoothing the fabric. The interpreter spoke again. "Please come forward. Take what you need." None of the Japanese women moved. They stood in their formation, eyes forward, waiting for the other condition, the catch. In their experience, nothing came without cost. Food required labor. Medicine required information. Kindness was a tactical maneuver. Lieutenant Commander Lawson seemed to understand their hesitation. She picked up a heavy winter coat, walked slowly to the nearest Japanese woman, a former sergeant named Yuki Tanaka, who had lost 3 fingers to frostbite in Manchuria, and held it out. "Please," she said in Japanese. "It is cold. You need this." Sergeant Tanaka looked at Lieutenant Nakamura, seeking permission or guidance. Nakamura gave the slightest nod. Tanaka reached out with her 7-fingered hands and took the coat. She held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, the quality of the wool. Then she put it on. It fit. The coat had a silk lining, intact buttons, deep pockets. It was the kind of coat Tanaka's family could never have afforded. Even before the war, something broke in the room. The other American women came forward, arms full of clothing. They approached each Japanese woman individually, offering items, helping them select sizes. There was no processing line, no bureaucratic forms. The American nurses smiled. They did not speak much. The language barrier prevented extensive conversation, but they communicated through gesture. They held up dresses for approval, found shoes that might fit, offered stockings and undergarments with careful discretion. Lieutenant Nakamura found herself face to face with a young American ensign who could not have been more than 21. The woman held a pile of clothing, a gray wool skirt, a white cotton blouse, a cardigan sweater, and the dark blue coat Nakamura had noticed earlier. The ensign said something in English that the interpreter relayed. "I think these will suit you. The coat is very warm. I wore it during winter in Chicago." Nakamura took the items. The fabric felt foreign in her hands. Too soft, too clean, too whole. She had not worn civilian clothing in 3 years. She had not owned anything that was not stained, torn, or repaired with crude stitching. She held the coat up, examining it. The label inside read, "Carson, Peary, Scott & Co., Chicago." A department store. This coat had been purchased by an American woman who had enough money to shop in department stores, who had then given it to the Navy to give to enemy personnel. The logic of it escaped her. Japan had bombed Pearl Harbor, occupied American territories, killed American soldiers. She personally had treated Japanese soldiers who had fought Americans in the Philippines. And now an American woman had given her a coat. She put it on. The weight of it settled on her shoulders, and something inside her chest, something she had carefully locked away since April 1945, cracked open. The coat was warm. It smelled faintly of mothballs and perfume. It had pockets deep enough to keep her hands warm. It was beautiful. Lieutenant Nakamura began to cry. She was not alone. Around the room, other women were weeping. Sergeant Tanaka pressed her ruined hands against her face, sobbing. A former lieutenant named Keiko Sato, who had maintained perfect composure through 2 years in a Manila field hospital, stood shaking as tears ran down her cheeks. Even the older women, the majors and senior officers who had trained themselves to show no emotion, were crying. They cried silently at first, trying to maintain discipline, but the crying grew louder. It became a collective release, 17 women weeping in a ship's cargo hold, while American women stood awkwardly nearby, offering handkerchiefs. The Americans looked distressed. Lieutenant Commander Lawson spoke quickly to the interpreter, concerned that they had somehow caused offense. The interpreter explained, haltingly, that these were not tears of sadness, but of something more complex: gratitude, shock, shame, relief. Emotions that had no single word. Nakamura tried to compose herself. She wiped her face with her old sleeve, not wanting to soil the coat. An American nurse, a different woman, older, with gray in her hair, came to her side and placed a hand on her shoulder. She said something in English. The interpreter was occupied with another weeping officer, so Nakamura did not know what the words meant. But the tone was clear: comfort, solidarity, recognition of shared humanity. That recognition was perhaps the most devastating gift of all. The Japanese military had prepared its soldiers and nurses for many contingencies. They had trained for combat, for privation, for death. They had been taught that the enemy was subhuman, that Americans were materialistic barbarians who lacked spiritual depth, that surrender meant certain torture and execution. These teachings had formed the psychological framework that allowed soldiers to fight to the death, and that made suicide preferable to capture. The women of the nursing corps had absorbed a modified version of this ideology. They would never become soldiers, but they would support those who were, and they would sacrifice everything for the empire. The American occupation had already challenged these assumptions. The expected atrocities had not materialized. American soldiers were not raping civilians en masse, were not executing prisoners systematically. They were instead distributing food, rebuilding infrastructure, and apparently gathering donations of clothing for former enemy personnel. The cognitive dissonance was profound. These women had been told that American wealth was a sign of moral poverty, that abundance led to decadence. Yet the abundance was being shared. They had been told that Americans valued things over people, materialism over spirituality. Yet these American women had given away their own possessions. They had been told that the enemy lacked honor and compassion. Yet here was compassion, offered freely, expecting nothing in return. The gift of the coat was not merely a practical transaction. It was a challenge to everything they had believed about the war, about the enemy, about the nature of virtue itself. After the initial distribution, the American women brought out more items. There were undergarments, slips, brassieres, stockings, offered with particular care to maintain dignity. There were shoes, multiple pairs in different sizes, lined up on tables for selection. There were handbags, scarves, even small bottles of hand lotion and soap. One crate contained sanitary napkins, a commodity that had been virtually impossible to obtain in post-war Japan. The American nurses demonstrated the use of certain items, explained through the interpreter how to adjust sizing, offered to help with fittings. The Japanese women gradually stopped crying and began participating more actively. They tried on different outfits, consulted with each other about fit and style. Lieutenant Nakamura watched Sergeant Tanaka select a dress, a simple cotton print with flowers, and hold it against herself, examining the effect. Tanaka had been a farmer's daughter before the war, had joined the nursing corps because it offered education and status her family could never afford. She had endured 2 winters in Manchuria, had watched men die of frostbite and gangrene, had eaten bark soup to survive. Now she was holding a flowered dress and smiling tentatively. The transformation happening in that cargo hold was not merely physical. These women were being offered the possibility of a future beyond survival. The clothing was not military issue, not utilitarian disaster relief. These were civilian clothes, the kind worn by women who went to work, visited friends, lived normal lives. Accepting these clothes meant accepting the possibility that such lives might be available again. Lieutenant Commander Lawson approached Nakamura as she was folding her old work coat, preparing to leave it behind. Through the interpreter, Lawson asked if everything fit properly, if there was anything else needed. Nakamura, regaining some composure, bowed deeply. She spoke in Japanese, and the interpreter relayed, "I do not understand why you are doing this. We were your enemies. My country attacked yours. I treated soldiers who killed Americans. Why would you give me your coat?" Lawson considered the question carefully. Her response, translated, was simple but profound. "The war is over. We are not enemies anymore. You are a nurse, like me. You did your duty, as I did mine. Now, we must help each other rebuild." The interpreter hesitated before translating the next part of Lawson's response, perhaps unsure of the philosophical nuances. Lawson had added, "Besides, no one should go through winter without a proper coat. That is not about politics or war. That is just human. Just human." The phrase, translated into Japanese as tada ningen, carried layers of meaning. In the context of wartime ideology, which had emphasized divine mission and spiritual superiority, the assertion of simple humanity was radical. It suggested that beneath the layers of national identity and military service and ideological commitment, there existed a common condition that transcended borders. For women who had been taught that their highest purpose was service to the emperor and empire, the suggestion that their fundamental identity was simply human, with human needs and human rights to dignity, was revolutionary. The distribution lasted 2 hours. By the end, all 17 women had been outfitted with complete sets of civilian clothing, coats, dresses, or skirts with blouses, undergarments, shoes, and accessories. They were also given small care packages containing soap, toothbrushes, hand cream, and sanitary supplies. The American women helped them pack their old clothes into the emptied donation crates, though several of the Japanese women chose to leave their worn-out garments behind entirely. Before the Japanese women departed, Lieutenant Commander Lawson addressed them once more. She explained that this distribution was part of a broader relief effort, that similar programs were being established at other repatriation centers. She emphasized that the clothing came with no obligations, no expectations of reciprocity or political allegiance. It was, she said, simply what people should do for each other. She concluded with an observation that the interpreter translated carefully. "I know that you have suffered greatly. I know that your country has suffered greatly. We hope that these small gifts can ease some of that suffering. We hope that you will find peace." The Japanese women bowed collectively, a formal expression of gratitude that also served to hide tears that had started again. They filed out of the cargo hold, down the gangway, back onto the Yokohama dock. But they were different now. They walked differently in their new clothes, several linked arms, a gesture of solidarity, and mutual support that would have been too informal for military personnel but was natural for civilian women. Mayan, Nakamura stood at the edge of the dock, for a long moment after the others had left, looking back at the USS Consolation. The ship's name seemed pointed, almost impossibly appropriate. She touched the buttons on her blue wool coat, testing their solidity. Real mother-of-pearl buttons, not the wooden substitutes that Japanese manufacturers had used during the resource-scarce war years. She put her hands in the deep pockets and felt the silk lining against her fingers. She thought of the American ensign who had worn this coat in Chicago. She tried to imagine that woman, her life, her world, her decision to give away something valuable. In Japan, such a gift would create obligation, would establish a relationship of debt that required eventual repayment. But the American woman would never know who received her coat, would never expect anything in return. The gift existed in a different moral economy, one that Nakamura did not fully understand but was beginning to recognize. The coat would last Nakamura 7 years. She would wear it through the difficult Reconstruction period, through her transition back to civilian medical practice, through the slow, painful process of building a new identity separate from military service. The coat would be with her when she opened a small clinic in Tokyo in 1948, serving the urban poor and displaced populations. She would wear it on the day in 1950 when the first American medical supplies arrived as part of the expanded relief efforts. And she would remember Lieutenant Commander Lawson's face as she distributed those supplies to patients who had once been taught to hate Americans. The coat would eventually wear out, its elbows thin, its lining torn, its buttons replaced with mismatched substitutes. But Nakamura would keep it long after it ceased being functional, hanging it in her closet as a reminder of the day her understanding of the world shifted. In later years, when her daughter asked about the old blue coat, Nakamura would tell the story of the American women on the USS Consolation, the gift that came without obligation, the moment when enemy became simply human. But that was years in the future. On February 12, 1946, Lieutenant Fumiko Nakamura simply walked away from the harbor in her new coat, feeling its warmth against the winter wind, crying again because the world had revealed itself to be more complex and more kind than she had ever been taught to expect. The clothing distribution on the USS Consolation was not an isolated incident. It was part of a larger, often overlooked dimension of the American occupation of Japan. The efforts by individual servicewomen and relief organizations to address the immediate humanitarian needs of the defeated population, particularly women and children. These efforts operated somewhat independently of official occupation policy, driven by personal initiative and humanitarian impulse. The American military establishment in Japan was overwhelmingly male, but approximately 5,000 servicewomen were stationed there by early 1946, serving as nurses, administrators, clerical workers, and relief specialists. These women occupied a unique position in the occupation apparatus. Unlike their male counterparts, they were often specifically tasked with engaging with Japanese civilian women, conducting health assessments, organizing relief efforts, and managing refugee centers. Their work was considered less strategic than the political and economic reforms being implemented by the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, General Douglas MacArthur. But for the millions of Japanese women struggling to survive in the ideal post-war chaos, these servicewomen were the face of American power. Many brought with them assumptions shaped by American wartime propaganda, which had depicted Japanese people as fanatics, as fundamentally alien. They expected to encounter a hostile, unrepentant population. Instead, they found exhaustion, hunger, and a desperate need for basic resources. The cognitive dissonance worked both ways. Just as Lieutenant Nakamura had to reconcile the reality of American kindness with her indoctrination about American barbarity, American servicewomen had to reconcile the reality of Japanese suffering with their expectations of a dangerous, ideologically committed enemy population. The clothing donations came from multiple sources. Individual servicewomen collected items from their own wardrobes. Military chapels organized drives. Relief organizations like the Red Cross and church groups in the United States sent shipments. The scale was impressive. By mid-1946, American relief organizations had distributed over 200,000 pounds of clothing to Japanese civilians, targeting particularly women and children in repatriation centers and urban refugee camps. These distributions were not without controversy. Some occupation officials worried that excessive generosity might undermine efforts to make the Japanese people reckon with the consequences of their government's aggression. There was concern that relief efforts might be perceived as weakness, might allow Japanese civilians to avoid confronting their national responsibility for the war. General MacArthur's staff included officers who believed that Japan should experience material privation as a form of moral education. But the women conducting the distributions operated from a different logic. They saw malnutrition, disease, and desperation not as deserved consequences but as humanitarian emergencies. They saw children in inadequate clothing, mothers without resources to feed their families, elderly people dying from preventable conditions. Their response was not driven by geopolitical strategy, but by immediate human compassion. This approach was deeply American in character, reflecting traditions of voluntary association, charitable giving, and pragmatic problem-solving that had long characterized American civil society. It was the same impulse that had driven American women to organize relief efforts during the European wars of the 19th century, that had motivated the establishment of settlement houses and social welfare programs during the Progressive Era. The American servicewomen in Japan were acting within a cultural framework that emphasized individual agency, that assumed personal responsibility to address visible suffering, that valued action over ideology. The Japanese women receiving these donations recognized something in the American approach that was distinctly different from their own cultural frameworks. Japanese society had strong traditions of mutual obligation and communal support, but these operated within defined hierarchies and networks of reciprocal duty. The gift from a stranger, expecting nothing in return, was a foreign concept. It suggested a worldview in which individuals had value independent of their position in social hierarchies, in which human need itself created moral claims that transcended national boundaries and historical enmities. This was the ideological substance beneath the material gift. The coat was warm, yes, and desperately needed. But it also carried a message about the nature of social order, about the relationship between individuals and the state, about the possibility of human connection across lines of nationality and culture. It was a sermon delivered in wool and buttons, a political philosophy embodied in silk lining. For women like Lieutenant Nakamura, who had lived their entire lives within a totalitarian system that demanded absolute subordination to state goals, this message was profoundly destabilizing. The Japanese wartime state had insisted that individual needs were irrelevant, that personal suffering was meaningless compared to national objectives, that the only virtue was service to the collective mission. Women had been told to sacrifice their health, their futures, their lives, if necessary. And then they had lost the war anyway, and the state that demanded their sacrifice had collapsed, and they were left with nothing. And then American women gave them coats. The psychological impact of this generosity was perhaps more significant than the material benefit, though both were real. The clothing distribution suggested that there were alternative ways of organizing society, alternative frameworks for understanding human value. They suggested that abundance could be shared rather than hoarded, that wealth could be a tool for alleviating suffering rather than a weapon for dominating others. They suggested that women, specifically, might have claims to dignity and resources independent of their role in supporting male warriors or national ambitions. These were dangerous ideas from the perspective of traditional Japanese social order. They were also irresistible ideas for women who had been discarded by that order once it no longer needed them. In the months and years following the clothing distribution, Lieutenant Nakamura and the other women who had visited the USS Consolation became informal advocates for engagement with American occupation authorities. They encouraged other former military nurses to participate in relief programs, to seek medical training opportunities offered by American organizations, to consider new possibilities for their lives. Some enrolled in nursing programs established by American medical missions. Others found work with occupation administration offices, serving as translators and cultural liaisons. A few even married American servicemen, though this was controversial and carried social stigma. What united them was a recognition that the old order had failed them utterly, and that the new order, whatever its flaws and contradictions, offered possibilities that had not existed before. They had been given coats, but more fundamentally, they had been recognized as individuals with inherent value, regardless of their utility to the state. That recognition could not be taken back. The symbolism of the coat, a blue wool coat from Chicago, given to a Japanese woman who had treated soldiers fighting Americans, persisted in Nakamura's memory as a kind of talisman. She would later describe it as the moment when she understood that the war had truly ended. Not in August 1945 with the Emperor's broadcast, but in February 1946, when an American woman shared her winter coat. The official surrender had ended hostilities. The gift had ended enmity. This distinction was crucial. Military victory could compel submission, but not transformation. Japan had been defeated before in its history, had experienced foreign occupation during the Meiji Restoration. What was different about the American occupation was not the fact of conquest, but the method and the message. The Americans came with overwhelming force, yes, but also with care packages, penicillin, and used clothing from department stores in Chicago. They came as conquerors who insisted on being seen as liberators, who believed that their political system and economic model were so self-evidently superior that exposure would create voluntary conversion. This was American ideological warfare at its most effective. Not propaganda posters or radio broadcasts, but practical demonstrations of an alternative way of living. The coat said, "This is what abundance looks like. This is what generosity looks like. This is what a society organized around individual freedom and economic productivity can provide." The coat said, "You do not have to choose between national pride and personal dignity, between cultural identity and material comfort." The coat said, "There is enough for everyone." Whether these messages were entirely accurate was beside the point. They were persuasive. They were persuasive to women like Lieutenant Nakamura, who had experienced the alternative, a society organized around spiritual purity and military glory that had led to starvation, defeat, and abandonment. They were persuasive to a generation of Japanese people who would rebuild their nation as a democratic, capitalist power closely allied with the United States, who would embrace American popular culture while maintaining Japanese identity, who would become living proof that the American model could be exported successfully. The coat was propaganda, but it was propaganda that worked because it was backed by genuine human kindness and material reality. The American women who distributed clothing were not cynical operatives implementing a strategic plan. They were nurses and relief workers who saw people in need and responded with the resources available. That their response also happened to serve American strategic interests, demonstrating the superiority of the American system, building goodwill, creating cultural connections that would facilitate long-term alliance, did not make it less genuine. This was the genius of the American approach. It aligned individual conscience with national interest, personal compassion with geopolitical strategy. The servicewomen distributing clothing believed they were doing the right thing as individuals. They were also, perhaps unknowingly, serving as ambassadors for American values and American power. The two roles were inseparable. For Lieutenant Nakamura, standing on the Yokohama dock in her blue coat, these larger strategic calculations were not yet visible. She experienced only the immediate reality: warmth, kindness, the disintegration of certainties. She had been given something she did not expect and did not deserve according to the logic she had been taught. The gift demanded a response, but not a reciprocal gift. That would have been easy, familiar. Instead, it demanded a reconsideration of fundamental assumptions about human nature, about social organization, about the meaning of the war itself. The coat forced her to ask questions that had no comfortable answers. If Americans could be kind to former enemies, what had the war been about? If abundance could be shared, why had Japan pursued empire through conquest? If individual human needs mattered enough to motivate gifts from strangers, why had the Japanese state demanded total sacrifice for collective goals? If women could be valued as individuals rather than as instruments of national policy, what had her service meant? These questions would occupy Nakamura for the rest of her life. She would never arrive at complete answers. But the asking itself was transformative. It made her a different person than she had been on February 12, 1946, before she boarded the USS Consolation. It made her a person who could imagine alternatives, who could question authorities, who could recognize shared humanity across boundaries that had seemed absolute. This, ultimately, was what the American occupation accomplished at its best moments. Not the formal institutional reforms, important as those were, but the individual transformations. The moments when propaganda became irrelevant because lived experience contradicted it. The moments when ideology collapsed in the face of simple human decency. The moments when a coat was just a coat but also everything. Years later, in 1972, Nakamura attended a reunion of former nursing corps members. They met in a Tokyo hotel. Middle-aged women with careers and families, successful lives built on the ruins of the empire they had served. The conversation turned, as it often did, to the war years, the hardships, the trauma, the strange grace of survival. Someone mentioned the clothing distribution on the USS Consolation. Several women who had been there began to cry again, 26 years later, remembering the American women with their donations, the overwhelming confusion of receiving kindness from enemies. One woman, the former Major Keiko Sato, said something that Nakamura recorded in her diary that night. "I think that was the day we became Japanese again, instead of imperial subjects. The Americans gave us back ourselves by treating us as humans first." It was an extraordinary statement, crediting the occupation with a form of liberation. Not everyone agreed. There were women in the room who resented the American presence, who experienced the occupation as humiliation regardless of humanitarian gestures. But many nodded. They understood what Sato meant. The collapse of the imperial system had left them without identity, without purpose. The American engagement, imperfect, sometimes arrogant, often misguided, had nevertheless offered a framework for rebuilding, not as servants of the state, but as individuals with agency and value. The blue coat hung in Nakamura's closet during that reunion, threadbare and useless but preserved. She sometimes showed it to visitors, told the story of its arrival in her life. It had become a personal relic, a physical connection to a moment of transformation. But it was more than personal. It was historical evidence of a particular kind of power. Not military or economic power, though both undergirded it, but the power of abundance generously shared, of enemies choosing to see each other as fundamentally similar rather than fundamentally different. This power had limits. American occupation policy included terrible errors. The decision to retain Emperor Hirohito compromised justice for war victims. The suppression of leftist movements violated principles of democratic freedom. The subordination of Japanese strategic interests to American Cold War priorities created lasting resentments. The occupation was an exercise in imperial power, whatever its humanitarian dimensions. The kindness was real, but it existed within a framework of domination. Yet even within that framework, individual acts of generosity created space for transformation. The American women who gave away their coats did not overthrow imperialism or solve the contradictions of occupation. but they offered something genuine to women who had been given nothing but sacrifice and suffering by their own government. They demonstrated that power could be wielded with compassion, that victory did not require cruelty, that former enemies could become allies through recognition of shared humanity. Lieutenant Fumiko Nakamura died in 1989 at the age of 68. Her daughter donated her papers to a historical archive dedicated to preserving the experiences of Japanese women during the war and occupation. Among those papers was a photograph, taken by an American photographer on the USS Consolation on February 12, 1946. It shows 17 Japanese women in their new clothes, standing in formation but smiling tentatively. In the front row, Lieutenant Nakamura wears the blue wool coat. Her hands are in the pockets. Her face shows traces of tears, but also something else, a cautious openness, a willingness to imagine that the future might be different from the past. The photograph is not famous. It appears in no major histories of the occupation, but it captures something essential about the lived experience of that period. The way grand historical forces manifested in intimate moments, the way geopolitical transformations became personal before they became political. The women in that photograph were standing at an inflection point in history, though they could not know it. They were experiencing the end of one world and the uncertain beginning of another. They were cold, and they were given warmth. They were abandoned, and they were seen. They were defeated, and they were treated with dignity. The blue coat from Chicago told them something that military victory alone could never convey, that there were people across the ocean who lived in abundance and who believed that abundance should be shared, who valued generosity over domination, who thought that strangers deserved kindness. It told them that the war had been about competing visions of human society, and that their vision had lost not merely militarily, but morally. It told them that another way was possible. Whether that other way fully delivered on its promises is a different question, one that Japanese people have been answering for themselves over the subsequent decades. But on February 12, 1946, in a cargo hold on the USS Consolation, 17 women were given a glimpse of an alternative. They cried because the gap between what they had been promised by their leaders and what they had actually experienced was unbearable. They cried because strangers showed them kindness that their own nation had denied them. They cried because a coat was warm, and they had been cold for so long. And in those tears was the beginning of everything that came after. The reconstruction, the alliance, the transformation of enemies into partners. Not because of policy or strategy, but because someone in Chicago gave away her winter coat, and it found its way to a Japanese woman who needed it. And that small act of generosity changed how one person understood the world. Multiply that moment by thousands, by millions, across years of occupation and engagement, and you begin to understand how history moves. Not through grand pronouncements or strategic master plans, but through the accumulation of small human connections that render old enmities absurd and new possibilities imaginable. The coat wore out eventually. The silk lining tore. The buttons fell off. The wool grew thin at the elbows and along the back, where Nakamura's body pressed against it year after year. But the memory remained intact, preserved not just in personal recollection, but in historical consequence. The women who received those clothes went on to build lives, to raise children, to participate in the creation of modern Japan. They carried with them the lesson of the coat, that former enemies could become friends, that abundance could be a gift rather than a weapon, that human dignity transcended national boundaries and historical hatreds. This was not the only lesson of the occupation, nor the most important in purely strategic terms, but it was a true lesson, verified in lived experience. And for women like Lieutenant Fumiko Nakamura, shivering on a Yokohama dock in February 1946, it was the lesson that mattered most. The lesson that said, "You are cold, here is warmth. You are forgotten, here is recognition. You are human, and that is enough." The blue coat is gone now, lost to time and use. But its warmth persists in the historical record, in the archives where Nakamura's papers rest, in the memory of a moment when the abstraction of international relations became concrete in the form of a gift, when propaganda became irrelevant because reality spoke louder, when 17 women cried on an American warship because they had been given clothing, and in that giving, they had been given back their humanity. This is how wars truly end. Not with treaties or surrender ceremonies, but with acts of unexpected kindness that make continuing enmity impossible. The signing aboard the USS Missouri ended hostilities. The clothing distribution aboard the USS Consolation ended hatred. Both were necessary, but history remembers the grand ceremony while forgetting the quiet moment in the cargo hold. Yet it was in that cargo hold that the future was actually decided, by women who chose compassion over vengeance, by women who accepted that choice, and by the small material objects that carried messages too powerful for words. A blue wool coat from Chicago, mother-of-pearl buttons, deep pockets with silk lining, the smell of mothballs and American perfume, the weight of it on thin shoulders, the impossible warmth, and tears, tears that washed away years of indoctrination, tears that acknowledged the ending of one world and the terrifying, promising beginning of another. Tears that said, "I did not expect this. I do not understand this. I am grateful for this. I am changed by this." 17 women cried in a cargo hold in Yokohama Harbor on a cold February day in 1946. Their tears fell on American fabric, soaked into wool that had crossed an ocean to offer warmth to former enemies. And in those tears was the seed of peace, not the peace of exhaustion or submission, but the peace of recognition. The recognition that beneath uniforms and national identities and wartime ideologies, there existed a common humanity that could not be destroyed by war and that, given the chance, would choose connection over division. The coat knew this before the women did. It was made to provide warmth, and it did its job without asking about nationality or history. It was just a coat. But, in being just a coat, practical, generous, shared freely, it became something more. Evidence of a different way of being in the world. Evidence that abundance could flow from victor to vanquished without humiliation. Evidence that enemies could be transformed into something else, not through force, but through recognition of mutual need and mutual dignity. Lieutenant Fumiko Nakamura wore that evidence for 7 years. She wore it until it fell apart, and even after it was gone, she carried its lesson. That kindness is more powerful than victory. That generosity can achieve what domination cannot. That a simple human gesture, "Here, you are cold, take my coat," can change not just an individual life, but the trajectory of nations. This is the truth that history books often miss in their focus on treaties and policies and grand strategies. The truth that peace is built in small moments of unexpected grace. The truth that former enemies become friends not through official declarations, but through thousands of individual decisions to choose compassion over revenge, generosity over retribution, recognition over contempt. The truth that on a cold day in Yokohama, 17 women received gifts they did not expect and did not deserve according to the logic of war. And in receiving those gifts, they learned that the logic of war was not the only logic available, that there was another way, that the future did not have to repeat the past. They learned this from a coat, from a simple blue wool coat that crossed an ocean to offer warmth to a woman who had been cold for too long. And they cried because the lesson was too large to hold inside, too overwhelming to process in silence. They cried because they understood, suddenly and completely, that everything they had been taught was incomplete, that their enemies were human, that they were human, that this changed everything. The tears dried. The women walked off the ship. The harbor returned to its usual chaos of reconstruction and occupation. But something had shifted, irrevocably. 17 women knew now that peace was possible, not as an abstract ideal, but as a lived reality. They had experienced it in the form of a gift that expected nothing in return. And they would spend the rest of their lives building the world that gift implied. A world where former enemies could become friends, where abundance could be shared, where human dignity transcended the boundaries that war had drawn. This was the true victory of the American occupation. Not the military triumph, important as that was, but the moral triumph. The demonstration that power could be exercised with generosity, that wealth could be a tool for healing rather than domination, that winners could afford to be kind because their victory was so complete that vengeance was unnecessary. The Blue Coat from Chicago taught this lesson better than any policy statement or propaganda campaign. It taught it in wool and buttons, in warmth and weight, in the smell of American department stores, and the sight of mother-of-pearl catching winter light. It taught it so effectively that 17 women wept, and their tears washed away the last residue of wartime hatred, leaving only gratitude and wonder, and the terrifying freedom of a future unbound by past certainties. This is how the world changes. One coat at a time, one act of unexpected kindness at a time, one moment of recognition at a time, until the impossible becomes inevitable, and former enemies cannot remember why they were enemies in the first place. And peace is not a fragile treaty, but a lived reality woven into the fabric of daily life. The coat wore out. The memory endures. And somewhere in the archives, a photograph preserves the moment. 17 women in new clothes, standing on an American warship, their faces showing tears and tentative hope. They have just learned something that will change their lives and their nation. They have learned it from strangers. They have learned it from enemies. They have learned it from a simple gift that said, "You are cold, here is warmth. You are human, and so are we. The war is over, and now we build something better." This is the lesson. This is the truth. This is why they cried.